Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on network cabling and connectors. Now, I will tell you that this is the first of a series of lessons that I have put together for you here that have to do with the networking aspect of computing. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, I thought this was an A+ course and this is all about building computers and all about the computer components. Well, keep in mind that one of the primary components in, well, pretty much all of today's computers is some form of network card, okay, or communications card, or some way to have that computer talk to another computer. So networking is a major part of computing in today's world, and that's why I have these lessons on networking for you. So to get things started, the first type of cabling that I would like to talk to you about is one that's called twisted pair. Now, twisted pair cabling, I have a few illustrations for you here. The top one is what a twisted pair cable would look like just to the average person who's looking at a cable. And you might be looking at that and you're thinking to yourself, isn't that an Ethernet cable? And the answer is yes, that's exactly what it is. Twisted pair cabling is your most commonly used Ethernet cable. The other illustrations that I have for you are showing you a little bit more about what the inside of that cable looks like. Okay, the part that you don't see, the part that's hidden. And to be more specific, we'll talk about this here, but the middle picture there is just your standard Ethernet cable, your standard twisted pair cable. And then the one below it has an extra layer of shielding on it, and it's called shielded twisted pair cabling. So we'll get to that in a minute. I'm jumping a little ahead of myself. Let's first talk about the different categories of twisted pair cabling. And there's a number of different categories, but the ones that I want you to probably pay the most attention to, because they're the ones that you will see out there most often, are the four I have listed. I have what's called Cat 3, Cat 5, Cat 5e, and Cat 6. Now, Cat 3, or Category 3, is a type of twisted pair cable that can handle data speeds up to a maximum of 10 megabits per second. Whereas Category 5 can handle up to 100 megabits per second, and Categories 5e and Category 6 can handle up to 1,000 megabits per second, or what's sometimes referred to as a gigabit, right? If you ever heard gigabit Ethernet. Now, one thing that you might be thinking right now is, well, what really is the difference between these different cables, right? What makes it that one is rated at 10 megabits, one's at 100, and another is at 1,000? Well, if you look at the middle picture where I show you that the inside of the cable itself is made up of all these wires, and if you look carefully, and we'll talk about the specifications before this lesson's over, but if you look carefully, well, first of all, what looks like a wire at the very top is not. That's just an extra piece of filling. It's actually there to help you sometimes rip away at the cable. And the one at the very bottom is more of a ground cable. But if you look at the colored wires in the middle, the ones that are green and orange, and it looks red, but it's actually brown, believe it or not, in blue, you'll see that there's actually two wires of that color or that related color. And those wires are twisted around one another, right? Hey, is this starting to come together? Why it's called twisted pair cabling? It's because each pair of wires are twisted. Now, why are they twisted? The reason they are twisted, and this is just a real quick electrical engineering 101. When you have two electrical wires and they are running in perfect parallel with each other, right? If they were just running straight through, right next to each other, as the signal travels along, and really I shouldn't even say signal because we're just talking about electricity here, as current travels along, you actually get what's called signal bleed. Okay, so the electricity actually emits outside of the wire itself, and it can then interfere with the wire next to it. When you twist the wires around one another, that does not happen. And that's the reason why we are twisting the wires. So now that we know why a twisted pair cable is called twisted pair, right, and the reason why we do twist those wires, let's go back to the question of, well, what makes something rated at 10 megabits versus 100 versus 1,000? And the real simple answer is it has to do with the number of twists. The more twisted it is, I know that sounds a little crazy. People say that about me. The more twisted you are, but the more twisted the wires are, the faster the data can travel. Okay, now I don't want you to worry yourself too much about the specs and the whys and all that. I just thought I'd give you a real basic lesson on that. Now, one other thing that you do need to know is that regardless of the category and the speed, when it comes to twisted pair cabling, a single cable can carry data up to a distance of 100 meters, not feet. Yeah, a lot of people get that confused. They think it's 100 feet. No, it's 100 meters before suffering from something called attenuation. Now, attenuation is basically the deterioration of a signal over distance. And it can also have to do with the number of connections as well. The more times you connect a cable to a node, you can lose a bit of the signal. And the best way I like to describe attenuation so you can understand it is if you think of sound. In other words, if you and I were in a room together, or how about even forget that we're in a room together. Right now I'm talking to you on this recording and you're listening. Right? You're listening through either a headset or maybe the speakers on your computer. Okay, so hypothetically, let's say you're listening on the speakers on your computer. And if you're sitting close enough to the computer, you can hear me. But if you move away from the computer, you're not going to hear me as well, right? Because the sound will deteriorate over distance, right? It'll start to dissipate. And when you get far enough away from the computer, you will no longer hear the sound of my voice. That's attenuation. And in the case of the twisted pair cabling, the data can travel along that cable for a maximum of 100 meters before it attenuates to a point that a computer couldn't understand the signal anymore. Now, I mentioned when we first came to this slide here that we have unshielded twisted pair and shielded twisted pair. Unshielded twisted pair, which is just your standard twisted pair cable, can be susceptible to something called EMI, electromagnetic interference. And basically that EMI is the same thing that I was starting to describe to you before when I did the little electrical engineering 101 where you have two wires running in parallel and then they can bleed into each other. Now, you're not going to get EMI from within the cable. What you are going to have happen though is if the cable is running along some other cables that are giving off strong EMI or certain other devices that can give off strong EMI, okay, things like motors and generators and things like that can give off strong EMI, well then you will suffer from a much shorter attenuation than the 100 meters that the cable originally should have been able to handle. Okay, you're going to get that interference. If you are in that scenario where maybe you need to run cable through a generator room or something like that, then you're going to want to use something called shielded twisted pair. And that's the picture I have at the bottom. And the idea is that each of the pairs of wires have an extra layer of shielding around them to protect them from EMI. Now, the last thing that I want to mention here, and we're actually going to revisit this again in just a little bit, is that twisted pair cabling uses something called an RJ45 connector. So now let's talk about coaxial cable. Coaxial cable is actually made up of 4 layers. Okay, and if you look at the top picture that I have there, I kind of have those 4 layers broken down for you. The innermost layer is what's known as the copper core. That's the actual wire that the data is transmitted on. Okay, so as data is traveling along a coaxial cable, it's that wire that is carrying the data. Around that copper core is an inner insulator, which is really only protecting the copper core from a shielding wire mesh, which is the 3rd layer. Okay, because if the copper core were to touch the wire mesh, well then, that wouldn't work very well, right? Because now data would be bleeding out onto the wire mesh because it's metal also. The idea behind this wire mesh, though, is it is a shield, again, protecting against things like EMI. And then the 4th layer, and this is the one that you and I would see if we were just looking at a coaxial cable, that's just an outer insulator. Okay, that's just your typical outer piece of plastic that you see that is protecting all the stuff that's on the inside. Now, there are a couple of different types of coaxial cables that are used in computer networking. I have one of them listed for you here, as well as an illustration of it in the lower right-hand corner, and that is something called thin net coaxial cable, or RG58. There is, or at least was, also something called thick net at one point in time. I will tell you that both are pretty much extinct, but thin net is still talked about much more than thick net. So the specifics on thin net coaxial cabling is that you, first of all, have speeds of up to 10 megabits per second. You kind of get an idea why we don't use it anymore. I mean, if we're maxing out at 10 megabits, that's not very fast. I mean, we can go back a decade and that's still slow. We do get a little bit more distance out of one of these cables than we do out of your twisted pair cable. We do get up to 185 meters before we suffer from attenuation. Uses a connector called a BNC, British Naval Connector. Again, we'll come back to it, but you can see it illustrated there in the lower right-hand corner. That's the type. That's what the BNC connector looks like. And as I've been mentioning all along, it's been primarily replaced by twisted pair. Now we have a couple other types of coaxial cable, RG59 and RG6, and these are the types that you would typically see used on your cable TV. Okay, so if you have cable or satellite and you have a coaxial cable running to your television, that's typically going to be RG59 or RG6 coaxial cable. And then the third type of cable that we need to talk about here is fiber. One of the main things with fiber to keep in mind is that it uses optical light pulses instead of electricity. So what does that mean? If we're using light instead of electricity, well, first of all, it's more secure. And the reason it's more secure is because if you have an electrical cable that's carrying data, all it really takes to be able to steal data off of that cable is if you were to cut away at the outer shielding and you were to touch another electrical cable, right? It's called splicing in. Splice in that extra electrical cable and touch the copper wires that are carrying the data. Well, that data is going to travel, when it comes to electricity, across any path it finds. So other than the fact that somebody might detect that the signal is not as strong as it used to be because it'll be weakened because we've attached another node, you can tap in fairly easily. Matter of fact, because of the EMI, the signal bleed that is given off of those wires, there are specialized devices that allow you to clamp onto the outside of a cable. You don't even have to cut into the cable. You clamp onto the outside, and it can steal the data off of the signal bleed that's coming off of those electrical wires. None of this happens when we're dealing with light pulses. Fiber optic cables need to be very carefully installed, very carefully polished, and if you were to try to cut into the center core, it's not going to get you anywhere. You can't just tap in another fiber optic cable, and so it's just not going to work. Okay, so it is more secure. It is not susceptible to EMI. You can lay a fiber optic cable right across a generator. It won't matter. You can have all the EMI you want. It's not going to interfere with light pulses. It is very fast, and it can travel very long distances. I don't have specifics listed here, right? I had that for the twisted pair and for the coaxial, where I said specifically you can go these speeds and you can travel these distances. Here's the deal. Depending on the specific class of fiber that you're using, you can travel just crazy fast speeds. Forget about gigabit. You can talk about 10 gigabit and even faster. And as far as distances, in the old days, we used to say that fiber cable, and this was back in the old, very basic fiber optic cable days. Okay, I'm talking about 15, 20 years ago. We talked about being able to go 2 kilometers or 2,000 meters. Okay, so relative to the 100 meters you get with twisted pair, you get 2,000 meters out of fiber before suffering from attenuation. I can tell you that there is fiber out there that can go even further than that, depending on how exactly it's been installed and the class of fiber cable that's being used. So what are the drawbacks to using fiber? Well, the drawbacks are, if you're going to get better security, not susceptible to EMI, it's going to be fast and travel long distances, well, it's going to cost you a little bit more. And I will tell you that very often the cost is not in the actual cable itself, it's in the qualified installation of the cable, okay? Because it's not nearly as flexible and as easy to use as your different copper-based cables. The good news is that fiber optic cable is much more reasonable now than it has been in the past. You're not going to be patching from one computer to another using fiber. There's just no reason for it. But where you do have needs for fiber, it's much more cost effective than it used to be in recent past. There are a variety of connectors that fiber optic cable will use. The three that are mentioned in the CompTIA objectives, so I listed them here, are your SC, ST, and LC connectors. I want to go real deep into the connectors because, first of all, those are not the only three. There's not always a 100% consistency as to exactly why or when you use each one, but I just wanted to give you an idea that those are the three that I know CompTIA has listed in their objectives that you should know about. The one thing I do want to tell you about fiber optic cable, though, before we move on, is that these light pulses that we're referring to, these are laser light pulses. One thing you never, ever, ever want to do is look into a fiber optic cable. Okay, so when you're looking at these various connectors here, if you ever have one in your hand in real life, don't look down it. Now, if it's not plugged in, I mean, if it's truly just a loose cable that's not plugged into anything, it should be fine. Again, I caution you because it's almost kind of like saying, well, if the gun's not loaded, feel free to look down the barrel. Yeah, you know, it's one of those where, do you want to risk it? The reality is that if a fiber optic cable was connected on the other end, think of this. It's giving off a laser light that can travel, miles. What do you think that's going to do to your eye if you look right down at that laser? It's going to destroy it. So please, please be very careful if you're ever working with live fiber optic cables. Now, there is one other aspect of fiber that I want to make sure that you understand, and that is there are two different types in the sense that we have what's called single mode and we have multi-mode. The idea behind single mode fiber cable is that it has a much smaller core. It is laser based, and these are the ones that can travel very long distances. All right, so everything that I've been describing to you is really along the lines of single mode fiber. But we also have multi-mode fiber, which has a larger core, is more of an LED based light. Okay, so it's not going to be as dangerous or as intense. It's also not going to be as finicky, but it's also going to give you much shorter distances. Okay, so please understand the differences between single mode, which is your small core, thin little laser light, very long distances, multi-mode, larger core with an LED-based light, shorter distances. And then we need to, once we've talked about the different types of cable, right? Once we've figured out whether we want twisted pair, coaxial, or fiber, we need to think about that outside part, right? No matter what type of cable we were talking about, they all have some kind of outside, some form of plastic that actually, makes up the cable itself. Well, we need to talk about plenum grade cable versus PVC grade cable. So first of all, what the heck is this thing plenum, right? That name. What is the plenum? Well, a plenum is an enclosed space used for airflow. Lots of times it's thought of as the area above a drop ceiling or maybe below a raised floor. If you are going to be running cables through one of these spaces where it's enclosed, and the danger here, by the way, is that if you have this enclosed space and you ever had a fire, and it doesn't have to be a fire, okay? It could be an electrical fire. Your standard PVC grade cable is going to give off toxic fumes. And you don't want those toxic fumes to gather in these enclosed spaces where they then may be released and hurt somebody. Plenum is another term that you'll hear used if you're talking to somebody who's dealing with heating and cooling, okay, and all about airflow. There's a plenum area inside your furnace, your AC unit, okay? So, again, if you have wires that potentially could melt and give off toxic fumes that are then gathered, and then maybe a ventilation system kicks on and those fumes are going to be exhausted into areas where humans are going to be, that can be very dangerous. Plenum grade cable is one that has a special type of, it still has that plastic type exterior, but when burned, disintegrates into a harmless powder. And I'm kind of going a little old school with that because there are different grades at this point. And one thing I need to point out, because I had somebody call me out on this once, there are even plenum grade PVC cables. Okay, it's just to confuse everything. There are certain grades of PVC now that are plenum grade. Even though traditionally it was always thought that PVC gave off toxic fumes, we now have PVC that can be burned without giving off the toxic fumes. The idea is you need a plenum grade cable, regardless of what it's made of, which does not give off toxic fumes when burned. All right, I said we were going to come back and look at the connectors, so let's look at them once again. Some of the connectors that I want you to be familiar with. At the top left here we have RJ45. Okay, this is your standard twisted pair, or again, some people will just call it Ethernet cable connector. It looks like an oversized phone cable connector, and it is, right? Because right below it I have an RJ11. That would be your standard telephone wire connector. Okay, so if you're still using like an old dial-up modem, that's the type of connector you're going to have on there. The big difference between an RJ11 and an RJ45 is the number of wires that are able to be housed inside of that connection. The RJ45 can house the 8 wires that are needed for your twisted pair cabling that is used with Ethernet networking. When it comes to coaxial, I mentioned the BNC. Okay, so I have a picture of that there, and it's the type of connector where actually you slide it on. I don't know if you can really see this here, but the idea is you slide it over a peg, and then you twist about, depending on the exact connector, between an eighth to a quarter turn to lock the cable in place. Whereas the F connector that you see at the bottom, in the middle there, is the type of connector you would have with your standard RG59 or RG6 cable that you'd have with your cable TV. There's a number of different types of these connectors. Some just slide right on. Some you have to, in like the one that's illustrated here, you'd slide the connector over a peg, right? Being careful to get that copper wire in the middle to go into the hole in that peg, and then you would screw it on. Okay, we're all familiar with those because those are the same types of connectors we use on our cable TV all the time. And then on the right, we have the same 3 fiber connectors that I had mentioned earlier. The only difference is this time I'm actually pointing out which one is SC, which one's ST, and which one's LC. That's what they look like, in case you were curious. Now, before we wrap things up, there is one other thing that I'd like to go over with you. Since the number one most commonly used cable that you're going to use, in computer networking around the office would be twisted pair cabling or Ethernet cabling, I want to talk to you about the actual wiring standards. In other words, I mentioned that there were 8 wires, right? And they were twisted into 4 pairs of wires. But then when those 8 wires end up going into the RJ45 connector, they actually have to go in a certain order. And that's what I have illustrated for you here. The EIA, TIA, which I won't worry about defining those exact letters for you. I'll tell you it's a bunch of geeks that make some standards. The EIA, TIA, they came out with the 568A and 568B standards. And they created this standard so that we would all know that when we terminate a cable, okay, in other words, we take a wire like you see in the picture on the top, and we take those wires and we shove them into that RJ45 connector that we have in the bottom there, they have to be in a certain order in order for data to travel along them properly. And so whereas I mentioned that the different colors that we have, I mentioned that there's green and there's blue and there's orange and there's brown. Well, what there actually is there's one wire that's just solid green, and another one that it's striped. It's a green and white stripe. Same thing with the blue. There's a solid and then a blue and white stripe. The orange, there's a solid orange and an orange and white stripe. And then the brown, there's a solid brown and the brown and white stripe. And as you can see from the 568A standard, you need to have green, white first, then green, then orange and white, then blue and white, then orange, then brown and white, and then brown. And I will tell you that a standard Ethernet patch cable, okay, just your standard Ethernet patch cable, if it has been terminated correctly, it will have 568A on both ends. In other words, all twisted pair cable would have this wiring scheme in all of its jacks. So then you might ask yourself, well, why do we even have 568B then? Well, the reason for 568B is for the purposes of creating what's called a crossover cable. And with a crossover cable, the idea was if you are going to connect two computers directly to one another, as opposed to connecting a computer to some other networking device like a switch or a hub or a router. And these are devices, by the way, I will go into more detail in another lesson. But the idea is when you were connecting a computer into a device, the device knew that it was going to have computers connected to it. And so the port on the device itself was designed so that whatever wire the computer was transmitting on, that would be the wire it would expect to receive on. Whereas when you connect two computers to each other, computer A is expecting to transmit on a certain wire, and computer B is also expecting to transmit on that same wire, not receive on that wire. Uh-oh, we have a problem. Both computers are transmitting on the same wire, and they're both listening on the other wire. They're never going to talk to each other. So that's where the crossover cable came into place, and that's 568B. We switched around some of the wires. Okay, you'll notice not all of them. You notice that 4, 5, 7, and 8 are the same. 1, 2, 3, and 6, we have switched around, and the idea there, again, has to do with now you have one computer who thinks, all right, I need to transmit, hypothetically here, I'm not going to be literal with this. I'll say I'm going to transmit on port 3. We'll say each computer thinks I want to transmit on port 3 and I want to listen on port 1. Well, that's good because as one computer who has one end of the cable with 568A transmits out on wire number 3, which is the orange and white, when it gets to the other computer, which has 568B set up on that end of the cable, well, that data is actually now coming in on wire number 1, which is the receive port that it's listening on, and so it works. And then the same the other way around. If that computer with 568B transmits on wire number 3, which is the green and white, well, on the other end, that computer has 568A, well, that ends up on pin 1. So we're all good there. Here's what I'm going to tell you, though. Yes, you should know these standards, but for the most part, we don't worry about crossover cables anymore. And the reason why we don't worry about crossover cables anymore is because most of today's networking cards, whether it be on a computer or on a device or whatever, they're what's called auto sensing. They have figured out how to automatically sense what type of device they're connected to based upon where the data is coming in from, and then they can acclimate to whatever type of cable you've used. So I actually had, at one point, bought a box in bulk of about 100 crossover cables. And right after I bought them, I didn't have a need anymore. I bought them because I was working at a place that we had a bunch of computers. It was actually a training center, and I had 30 computers in a room, and they all had to be paired up. And so I had to have a crossover cable going in between them. So that's 15 cables for each classroom. But what happened was that I left that company right after making that purchase. Man, that's a bummer. But guess what? Not really. I still use those cables to this day. Because even though they're crossover and one has 568A on one and 568B on the other end, that's okay. I use them as a patch cable. Because the devices that I'm plugging them into, they're auto sensing and they can figure that out. So we're good. So that does bring us to the end of this lesson. Okay, so again, this is the first of a series of lessons on networking. And the main thing I want you to take from this is understanding that we have 3 main types of cables: twisted pair, coaxial, fiber. Know the speeds, know the distances, know the benefits, know where you would use each one. Other than that, I thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.